Hey guys, it's PrimordialAA back again, and we're going to do the intermediate concepts on Heads Up Sitting Goes. It's going to be a two-part series, just like the introductory concepts. So, let's get started. Now, the first concept we're going to go over is classifying your opponents. There's two ways that you can classify your opponents: their playing style and their aggression factor. Now, under playing style, there's two different options. They're either tight or loose. And for aggression factor, there are also two options. Most players are either passive or aggressive. Now, that creates four basic player types: the tight passive, the tight aggressive, the loose passive, and the loose aggressive. So now let's talk about how we can adjust to each of these player types to maximize our edge against each kind. When you're playing against a tight passive player, let's say after seeing 15 or 20 hands with this opponent, you realize that he is rarely calling you out of position. He is folding quite a few of his buttons, and you saw him play the following hand. So you're dealt 7-7, the opponent raises, and you decide to just call. The flop comes Ace 6-2 rainbow, so no flush draws or any draws in general. And you check, and he only bets half the pot. You decide to call. The turn comes a 10 of spades, bringing no flush draw. You check, and he checks behind. The river comes a 9 of diamond. You check once again, and again he checks behind. He shows ace queen, and you muck. Now we decide that our villain is a grade A tight passive player. We know this because he had a very strong hand, and he got about as little value as he could possibly get out of it. And he had no real reason to play this hand passively. There was no reason for him to suspect that he was beat, and there were no draws that were coming in. So we label him as a tight passive, so now we want to know how we should adapt to this kind of opponent. Well, first of all, we should widen our raising range, probably to 100%. We've seen him fold quite a few of his buttons, and we've seen him fold quite a few of his hands out of position, and because of this, if he's not getting involved and he's playing his hands as passively as he is with his strong hands, then we're just going to be able to beat up on him by raising as much as we can before the flop. And by as much as I can, I mean frequency, not size, because actually we want to lower our raise sizes so we don't give away as much when he does get involved with his better hands. This is especially important as blinds escalate, but say when you're at 15-30 and you both have full stacks, you're 50 big blinds deep. Against this kind of opponent, you only need to be min-raising rather than 3xing, because he's just not going to call many hands at a position, and most of your value is going to come just by constantly stealing his blinds. And because we widen our raising range here, we want to make sure that we're not getting involved in any big pots when he actually does have a good hand. So, since most of our value is coming from stealing the blinds before the flop, we're going to make our raise sizes as small as possible. We can also lower our c-bet size to about half pot, but c-bet close to 100% frequency. This comes just from the fact that the opponent is very tight, and he's not going to be continuing on a lot of boards. Most players that are tight passive are going to be playing fit or fold, and if they don't hit a strong piece of the flop or a strong draw, they're just going to fold. So even if you give them odds to call by c-betting only half pot, they're usually not going to do it unless they have actually connected with the flop. So this again adds a lot of value to us by not giving away as much when they are getting involved. And lastly, we should tighten up our range out of position to hands that play very well post-flop, and also play them cautiously to avoid getting involved in big pots when dominated. Against a tight opponent, it's not such a big deal, because if he's passive, tight passive, he's not going to extract a lot even when you do get involved with a dominated hand. But still, you want to play cautiously against these kind of players, and you just want to make sure you're picking good spots to bluff against them, because they're going to let you take down a lot of pots and give you credit where they probably shouldn't, and making sure when you know that they have a strong hand because they're staying involved for multiple streets or multiple bets, that you are not senselessly bluffing, that you're only extracting and only betting for value. So now let's talk about a little bit harder kind of opponent. The tight passer is probably the easiest opponent out of all the 4-player types. A little bit more interesting playing style is the tight aggressive player. Now, most cash game players and a lot of MTT players know this style very well. So when they transition over to heads-up sit-and-goes, they're not used to playing as loose as they should, because the winning styles in those games are the tight aggressive style. So you'll probably see this kind of player quite a bit when you're playing at the middle stakes or lower stakes sit-and-goes, and it's probably the most taught style out of all styles in poker, whether it be by books or sites or anything else. After seeing 15 or 20 hands with this opponent, you realize that he is rarely calling you out of position, but he is opening a reasonable amount of his buttons, and you saw him play the following 2 hands. Here you're dealt 7-7 again. The opponent raises and you call. You check. He makes a standard c-bet to 80 and you decide to call once again. Now you check and villain bets 240 here. The pot size is 280. He bets 240. You decide he probably has a hand and you fold. He shows you ace-queen. So now you're dealt ace-jack. You make it 60, and he re-raises you to 200. You have ace-jack suited, and you decide to call a 3-bet. The flop comes all low cards, and you check it to him. The villain bets 320 into 400, and you fold, and he shows you pocket kings. Now, after seeing these hands and seeing his tendencies and frequencies, we decide that he can be generally labeled as a tight, aggressive player. How should you adapt? You should widen your raising range, but probably still fold out the bottom of your range. So, because he's tight, again, you want to be raising him and putting a lot of pressure on him, but he's not going to be afraid to 3-bet you. When he does play his strong hands, he's going to play them aggressively. So, you don't want to be getting involved with 100% of your hands, but you still definitely want to be getting involved with a large percentage of them, and be prepared to get played back at. So you have to be ready to play some of your hands post-flop. Now, you can keep your raise sizes the same, but you really want to avoid calling 3-bets. A very bad tendency people have against tight aggressive players is getting involved in mediocre hands, calling their 3-bet with queen-8 offsuit or things like that. And it's something you see all the time, and it's just not something that you can do profitably. These people's ranges are very strong in these situations, and you're just not going to be able to play those kind of hands profitably, even in position. You can lower your c-bet size to about half pot, but you really want to make your frequency based on your opponent and the board texture. The reason for this is he is tight, and that just means he's choosing his hands selectively, but we can't expect him to just roll over like the tight passive player was. He's going to be check-raising you on some boards with draws, with strong hands, and sometimes possibly with air, when his hand that was probably best pre-flop missed a flop completely. There's nothing to say a decent tight aggressive player won't make solid bluffs against you. So you can lower your c-bet size just because we assume he's not going to get involved too often. But when he does, he's going to be doing it aggressively. So you can't c-bet with 100% frequency. Now, as normal against a tight opponent, you want to tighten up your out-of-position calling range. You don't expect them to be raising a large percentage of their hands, and that means when they do, they're more likely to have a better hand. So you really want to avoid playing marginal hands out of position, and also hands that are easily dominated. Playing hands that are dominated quite frequently by your opponent's range is going to be a huge mistake against a tight aggressive opponent, because you're going to get in a lot of trouble with your top pairs, and when they're giving you multiple streets of action, you're not going to have an easy time getting away from it, and you're almost always going to be dominated or beat in a different way. So you want to play these hands cautiously and be selective about what you play out of position. So now let's talk about the loose passive. After 15 or 20 hands with this opponent, you realize that he's calling more than 50% of your button ranges. He's opening almost 100% of his buttons, and he has 3-bet you 3 out of the first 9 times. And you saw him play the following 2 hands. You're dealt pocket nines. The villain raises. You re-raise just to 180, and he calls. The flop comes ace 6-2 rainbow. You bet 200, and he calls. The turn comes a 10, also making the board rainbow, so there's no flush draws. And you bet 360. He opts to call once again. The river comes the jack of diamonds. You check, and he checks behind and shows 4-5 offsuit. Now, the fact that he floated a gut shot lets us know that he's pretty loose, obviously, and the fact that he called a 3-bet pre-flop with 4-5 offsuit. And the large thing about him being passive, obviously, is the fact that he had no showdown value with his hand, and he opted not to turn his hand into a bluff. When he's drawing with so few outs here, he can't profitably be drawing just to hit the 3. His best option would have been to turn his hand to a bluff. And when he checks on the river, he knows that he has no hope of winning the hand, and he definitely should have bluffed there if he was still going to be involved in the pot. So this lets us label him as loose passive. And we see one more hand where he re-raises us to 200, he 3-bets us, and the flop comes 10-6-2. We check, he bets 120, which is weird. He bets 120 into 400. We decide to call. The turn pairs the top pair. We check and he checks. And the river comes a 4. And we check. He bets 120. And we decide to call. The villain shows 10-3 suited. So again, we see that he's loose. His opening range, his 3-betting range, all of this is very wide. And we also see that he's passive because he didn't play this hand very aggressively and he didn't extract value very well. So now let's talk about how you can adjust to players like this. This is a player that you see very, very frequently at low to mid stakes. People who understand that you need to be loose and heads up, or understand, they've watched videos or seen shows of good players playing solid aggressive poker and playing very loose poker, and they know you need to be aggressive heads up. So they misunderstand. They become loose, but they're not comfortable being aggressive or putting in the right kind of aggression. So it's something you see quite often, and the other thing you see very often is a loose aggressive opponent who's just overly aggressive. They know no end to their aggression, and they don't pick their spots very well at all. They're just constantly firing, and I think these are probably two of the tougher. It's much tougher to play than a tight passive opponent, obviously, and I think it's two that you see the most frequently at low to mid stakes. You guys will probably deal with them quite a bit. So against a loose passive, we should widen our limping range and restrict our raising range to above average hands and those that play well post-flop. Now, the reason that we're doing this is we want to widen our limping range a little bit because he's going to be calling us out of position often. And when we have hands like, 6-8 offsuit or 6-9 suited, stuff like that, a lot of times when he's calling us and calling bets post-flop, we're going to have no clue where we're at in the hand, and we're not going to, most of the hands that we come up against are going to have better showdown value against us unless we're hitting our pairs. So because of that, if he's calling, even with, like we saw with 4-5, we're going to get to showdown quite a bit. And we want to keep the pot small when our hands aren't going to win at showdown a lot. So if we can limp a little bit more often, this allows us to control the pot size, value bet when we have a hand, and still expect to get called. And also, since we know we're going to be going to showdown quite a bit, it limits our losses when we get there without making a hand. We can lower our raise sizes so to keep the pot small and controllable. Against most loose opponents, I'll limp very frequently, or I'll min-raise coming into probably starting around 15-30. I'll only min-raise the button and not 3x anymore. And this is just because you're going to be getting 3-bet a ton. They're going to be raising your limps, and it allows you to just manage the pots. You play the pots because they're loose. You can always limp re-raise them. You basically get to choose how big you want each pot to be when you're playing them. So this allows us just to have more complete control of pot size. Now the c-bet size can be kept the same, and it can even be increased because you expect this opponent to be floating with a larger amount of hands, but you should lower your c-betting frequency against these kind of opponents. You can no longer c-bet 90 or 100% of your hands profitably just because they won't be folding. So a lot of your hands that don't have showdown value, this is why you want to keep the pot small before the flop, because you're not going to be able to take it away post-flop as easily as you can against a tight opponent. And our out-of-position range can be widened a little bit to include all hands, or most hands, that are well above average, as well as those that play well post-flop. So, especially against a loose passive opponent, because you're going to be seeing showdown a lot, and he's not really going to extract value out of his hands very well, although he'll be involved with a large number, I'm very, very sorry about that. So, even though he's going to be involved with a large number of hands, he's not going to play them aggressively, which means you're going to see showdown a lot, so all above average hands are worth a lot more. So the last player type is the loose aggressive opponent, and this one is probably one of the better styles to play, maybe not to the extreme that you see most people play it, but it's also going to be one of the hardest ones to play against because it comes closest to ideal heads-up strategy, and it puts you to a lot of tough decisions. So learning how to adjust to these kind of opponents should help you a great deal. Sorry about my voice here, I'm a little bit getting a little bit sick. So playing against a loose aggressive. After seeing 15 or 20 hands with this opponent, you realize that he's calling more than 50% of your button ranges. He's opening almost 100%, and he's 3-bet you 3 out of his first 9 buttons. You saw him play the following 2 hands. You have ace-9. He raises and you call out of position. The flop comes ace-high, rainbow board. You check, he makes a c-bet, and you call. The turn comes a 10 of spade, again negating any flush draws. You check, and he fires a second bet of 200, and you call. Now the river pairs the 10, and you check one more time, and the villain bets again. You decide to call this bet, and he shows up with 4-8 offsuit. This right here obviously lets us know right away that our villain is loose aggressive. He's opening a very wide range pre-flop, and he's firing 3 barrels. We see one more hand where we raise to 60, our opponent 3-bets us, and we re-raise him to 440. Villain calls the 4-bet and open shoves or lead shoves an ace-jack-queen flop. We decide we can probably pick a better spot against this opponent, and we fold. Again, we can now easily label this opponent as a loose aggressive opponent. How should we adapt? We should begin to merge our limping and raising ranges and tighten them up. Our opponent's going to be putting a lot of pressure on us. They're going to be 3-betting us frequently pre-flop. They're going to be raising our limps. And because of this, you want to start merging, and also because of the fact that he's going to play his hands very aggressively post-flop as well as loosely before the flop. We really want to start mixing in some of our stronger hands into our limping range. So because of this, when it becomes 15-30, 25-50, or especially 50-100 is very good, but 15-30 and 25-50 is probably where people are going to be their loosest because they still feel like they have a lot of room to work with. If you mix in some limp re-raises or limp shove some of your smaller pocket pairs at 25-50, you'll gain quite a big edge over your opponent here just because they're going to be hammering on your blinds. And if you raise a hand like 2-2 at 30 big blinds, you're going to see so many flops that are just not good at all for you. So between 20 and 30 big blinds against a loose aggressive opponent becomes much better to limp re-raise or limp shove these hands than it does to raise them before the flop. And to balance you're also obviously going to be limping your hands like 6-7, 7-8, everything, all your connectors, your 9-jack suited, stuff like that. So because of this, you also want to balance your ranges, and it will be good to mix in some very strong hands, limping your very top of your range, queens, kings, aces occasionally. Sometimes limping ace king or ace queen and trying to get dominated aces to play a big pot pre-flop with you. And it's just something that you're going to have to do against these opponents. It will increase your edge against these opponents because you want to be able to maintain a fairly wide limping range, and you don't want them to just run over all of your limps. So because of this, you have to balance your ranges, and you have to begin to merge your limping and raising ranges. And if your opponent begins to adjust and he sees that you are raising, limp raising him often, then if he sees that you're limping a lot and he begins to raise your limps constantly, then some hands that you would limp, like 7-9 suited, you can raise because he'll probably give it a little bit more credit. But this comes from a more advanced or better thinking opponent. So we'll lower our raise sizes to keep the pot small and manageable, just like our previous loose passive. And we'll also only call 3-bets with hands that dominate a large portion of his range or play very well, or flop top pair often post flop. Hands like queen king are going to be great to call 3-bets against these opponents with, just because queen king dominates a ton of their ranges that they're going to be 3-betting. Loose opponents will 3-bet, queen 7, queen 8, queen 9, all of that looks very good to them, and the same with a lot of KX hands. We can keep our c-bet size the same, or even increase it, again, like our previous opponent, to 3/4 or 4/5 the pot, but we should lower our c-betting frequency, especially against a loose aggressive opponent. They're going to be check raising you on a ton of boards. They're going to be putting you to very, very tough decisions. A lot of them will lead, you'll raise, and then they'll lead into you on a lot of flops. Because of this, you really want to be a lot more selective about which boards you choose to c-bet, and also you want to know that they're going to give you credit when you are c-betting for a bluff. So if your hand doesn't have showdown value, you want to make sure that they're not going to float you too wide before you start turning some hands into bluffs. Otherwise, it's just going to be throwing money away. And of course, against an aggressive opponent, we should tighten our ranges out of position, because they're going to be putting a lot of pressure on you, and you just only want to play hands that play very well post-flop, because you don't want to have to stand them firing 3 barrels at you constantly when you're out of position, or constantly putting you to tough decisions. Just going to make your life a lot harder, and it's going to get you in many more tough spots and force you to make many more tough decisions, which inevitably will decrease your edge. So let's talk about flop textures a little bit. It's an intermediate concept that's very well known to most cash game players, and the texture of a flop is the way of describing how many drawing possibilities a board has. This is very important when playing against some thinking loose aggressive opponents. For example, board comes Queen of Clubs, 7 of Hearts, 2 of Spades. This flop would be considered very dry because there are no straight draws and also no flush draws. However, a 9 of Spades, 10 of Spades, Jack of Diamonds would be very wet or draw heavy because there are many straight and flush draw possibilities, and there's just so many hands that hit this board that would continue. You should combine the texture of the flop with your perceived, the texture of the flop with your perceived range of your opponent to decide how likely he is to have hit a hand on each board. Now, this becomes very important, like I said, when you're playing thinking aggressive players. This becomes important because you need to know when somebody's raising 80% of their range before the flop, if the board becomes a dry ace-high board, you can't just fold every time that you don't have the ace. They're obviously, if they're opening a large portion of their hands, 80 to 100%, they're not going to have an ace every time they c-bet there, and so it becomes a very good situation for you to check raise them on that board. But again, you have to be out-thinking your opponent, because your opponent can re-raise you with nothing on the same board if he knows that you'll raise that board with nothing. So flop textures are very important when you're picking your spots in which to combat aggression. So say you're playing a tight aggressive opponent. The board comes 5-7-9 with a flush draw. He makes a standard continuation bet. Would this board be a good board to check raise him on? The answer is yes, because the board is very unlikely to have improved his hand, and it's difficult for him to continue with most of his range. If you check raise a tight aggressive opponent here, he's not going to be able to continue with all of his hands like Jack Queen, Jack King, 10 Jack, a lot of Ace X hands, Ace 2, Ace 3, Ace 4, even Ace Jack won't continue a lot of times. You'll see a lot of people call here with Ace King, Ace Queen. People don't get away from it too easily, especially at the lower limits, but it's going to be a bad call overall for them. And besides them having flopped some strong pair like King 9 or Ace 5, Ace 7, Ace 9, or having a pocket pair in their hand, they're just not going to hit this board very often. So you're going to get a lot of folds here if they're making a tight aggressive opponent should continuation bet with a good frequency. So they're going to be making a c-bet frequently, but their hand just doesn't match up with this board very often at all, which makes it a very profitable spot for you to check raise. However, on the contrary, an Ace-King-Jack board with a flush draw would not be a good flop to check raise a tight aggressive opponent on because it hits so much of his range. Now on the other hand, when you're playing a loose aggressive opponent, say you call 9-10 suited from the big blind, and the flop comes Ace 8-3, giving you a backdoor flush draw and a backdoor straight draw. Not really important. He makes a continuation bet when you check. Is this a good board to check raise him on? The answer again is yes. Against a loose aggressive opponent, like I was talking about previously, he's just not going to have an ace in his range very often at all, and when you do get called, when he just calls you, he can call you here with pocket fives, maybe with a 3, sometimes with queen king. You still have a lot of ways to improve. He's not always going to have the ace when he calls, and you're also going to get quite a bit of folds here against a decent opponent. Now, the more important thing, I meant to mention this, against a loose aggressive opponent, the first board, the 5-7-9, might not be a good board to check raise him against, because a loose aggressive opponent can reshove a lot of overcards there, like maybe they'll reshove queen king or a gut shot straight draw. However, on the Ace 8-3 board, when a loose aggressive opponent, even a loose aggressive opponent, will get rid of hands like queen king, because the ace is kind of an ultimate card. Even if they hit their queen or the king, a lot of the times when they hit it, it's not going to be good. So because of this, it makes them give up much easier. So when it's a dry board with one high card, normally they're going to decrease the hands that they can float you with or play back at you with by a ton. So I just wanted to point out, when playing a loose aggressive, the first board might not be a very good board to do it, where the board that I gave in the example for the loose aggressive is a very good board to do it on. Now, basing your decisions on your opponent's ranges and board textures comes hand in hand with thinking on multiple levels. It's something that is very difficult to teach, but something you must always think about and always try to be aware of. By using your superior thinking and combining it with picking the best possible spots, this will give you a huge edge in heads-up sit-and-goes. Especially as you're moving up to the higher limits, this becomes very, very important. There's so many players that are solid fundamentally, but just autopiloting loose aggressive opponents, or unthinking loose aggressives, or thinking on a very low level. If you can pick good spots by examining their ranges and the board textures and their likelihood of hitting the boards, then by being able to outthink them, you'll be able to actually gain a huge edge on a lot of the decent winners in heads-up sit-and-goes, and obviously a big edge on all of the losing players or the worst players. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is Sage. I said I was going to get into this in the intermediate concepts, so this is where we're going to end the slideshow. It's a very solid foundation for any heads-up player's endgame. And I'm sorry, I meant to have this up 1 second before, so just give me 1 minute while I pause the video. Okay, so Sage. What I do, I just go into Google and Google card player plus Sage, and it comes up on the very first link. You go ahead and wait a second for it to load, and you receive the following article. Written and published by Lee Jones and Card Player. So, you go ahead and scroll all the way down to the bottom. It's fairly long, and there's this handy table right here. Now, it teaches you how to compute what they call the power index, and the way you do it is each card has its rank. So a 2 is worth 2, a 7 is worth 7, a 9 is worth 9, and then the Jack 11, Queen 12, King 13, and Ace 15. Now, you take the power number, this is what they call the power number, for your higher card and double it, and you add the number of your lower card. It seems kind of complicated at first, but it's very, very easy. So say you receive a 9 and an 8. You double your 9 to make 18, and you add 8 to make 26. The other rules are, if it's a pocket pair, you add 22, and if they're suited, you add 2. Basically, if it's a pocket pair, it will always be a shove. I'll show you afterwards. The sum of the power index, or the sum is the power index of your hand. Now what you do, this is based on what they call R. R is the number of big blinds you have after you post the blinds. So for example, if it's 5100 and you have 800 chips and you're in the big blind, your R is 7 because you have 7 big blinds left after posting the big blind. Now by creating your power index, this is an exact table that will tell you exactly what to do for every limit up to 7, R equals 7, which is about 8 big blinds. It tells you exactly which hands to go all in with and which hands to call all in with. The jam section of this is much more important, as if a player is a lot of players, especially a lot of worse players, endgame is very, very important, and you can gain a very big edge over most bad players because most players do not call or shove nearly as wide as they should, not even close. So by shoving this range, it's unexploitable. Nobody will ever be able to get an edge on you shoving that range. Now, the thing is, calling, because most players shove too tight, you can actually adjust the calling range a little bit. If you know the player's playing very tight and you see them folding the majority of their buttons at 5100, even if they're at 5 big blinds, 6 big blinds, you may not want to call a 7 big blind shove with a hand like Queen 6 offsuit. But the jam section is always true and you should always stick to it. So say you're at 5100 again and your opponent has 800 chips, 700 after he posts his big blind, and you look down at Jack 4 offsuit. Or let's say you look down at Jack 2 suited. You double your Jack. Jack is worth 11, so that makes 22. You add your 2 for 24, and you add 2 for suited. That makes 26. So you'll shove Jack 2 suited all the way up to your opponent having 8 big blinds. So take a little bit of time. It'll probably take you 5 minutes at the most to figure out this system and figure out how to calculate the hands easily. I keep it saved in my links, and sometimes I even have it down in my bar when I'm playing. So if I come up in a spot where I don't remember Sage perfectly, I'll just pull up the link real quick. I'll check the number, say, oh, it's 24 for 5 big blinds, and then I'll make my decision. Learning this will increase your edge almost certainly if you're not playing endgame optimally, and it will help your game a lot. This should bring out your win rate without a doubt, and I hope it helps all of you. Let me know. Please send me some messages or go ahead and post in the forums if anybody has any questions on this or wants to know anything about it. And hopefully there's a little bit more. This only goes to 7 big blinds. I'll be able to get some good solid endgame in the next couple of videos that will show what good endgame should look like. This system is good, and you should always use it under 7 big blinds, but 8 to 15 big blinds is still a very, very tricky spot. So I'll try to cover that in the second part of this intermediate section by getting in some games. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. Feel free to contact me if you have any comments or suggestions, and I will see you soon for the next video.